Welcome to Brother Miller's Notes. I'm so glad you're with me today as we study sections 135 and 136 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And we go through a lot of material today. And I do anticipate this will be a little bit longer, so get prepared maybe with that pause button or fast forward button as you need to. We're going to talk about the events that lead up to the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith and the summary of the prophet Joseph Smith's life in section 135. We're then going to talk about who becomes the next leader of the church. How did the saints know that Brigham Young should be the next leader of the church? As well as we talk about why the saints have to leave Nauvoo. Even after the prophet Joseph Smith's dead, that increased mob violence occurs. And they leave Nauvoo and they're on their way west. And while they're on their way west, the camp of Israel needs some advice. Brigham Young seeks the Lord's counsel, and the Lord answers him. That revelation is known as section 136. But as I think about the events leading up to the prophet Joseph Smith, sometimes I just want to know, who are the bad guys? Who is it that are going to be these individuals that lead to the martyrdom of Joseph Smith? And I see there's three different groups. There are those on the outside, that's the mob. There are those on the inside who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they want to have a conspiracy against Prophet Joseph Smith. They want him dead. And there's also a third group. They're kind of like the inadvertent actors. They're the ones that are there, but maybe they don't really know the role they're playing. And I see them mixed in. But as with any organization, the people who can do the most damage are those who are inside. And so it is with Prophet Joseph Smith. There's a conspiracy against him that will lead, the events of these individuals lead to his martyrdom. The conspirators are led by William Law, Robert and Francis Higbee, Robert and Charles Foster, Sylvester Edmonds, and Joseph Jackson. They have put together a series of a narrative and some lies, and they're quite blatant. Joseph Smith gets word of this, and he just flat out exposes it as just nonsense. On Sunday, the 24th of March, 1844, quote, Joseph Smith says, "The lies that Higbee has hatched up as a foundation to work upon is, he says that I had men's heads cut off in Missouri, that I had a sword run through the hearts of the people, that I wanted to kill and put out of the way. I don't swear out a warrant against them, for I don't fear any of them. They would not scare off an old setting hen." Well, these conspirators, that happens, but it's like, we've got a plan on how to get you, Joseph. And at the April General Conference, the conspirators sought the downfall of the prophet. Confident the majority of saints would oppose the principle of plural marriage, they planned to bring up the subject at the business session of the conference. They were also prepared to argue that Joseph was a fallen prophet, because few, if any, revelations had been published and circulated among church members in the previous months. In an effort to thwart the conspirators, Joseph testifies at the beginning of the conference that he was not a fallen prophet, that he never felt nearer to God than at that time, and that he would show the people before the conference closed that God was with him. The next day he addressed the conference for 2 hours in what became as the King Follett Discourse. On that occasion, the faithful witnessed the majesty of their prophet. If you haven't had a chance to read the King Follett Discourse, I would encourage you to do it. It is one of the greatest sermons that Joseph Smith gives, and very, very powerful. And people who hear it feel he is the prophet. The conspirators are exposed in the church's newspaper. Here's what they're saying. Here's what it is. They are tried for their membership, and they're excommunicated. So after that comes out in the Times and the Season, which is the church's newspaper, they decide that they want to make their own newspaper and give their version of the truth, and they call it the Nauvoo Expositor. Their little byline is the truth, and nothing but the truth. And that is not the case with the content in the Nauvoo Expositor. Well, because there are so many lies and falsehoods in it, it is deemed that it is a public nuisance. The way that happens, that deeming, that judgment of it, is Joseph Smith, who's the mayor of Nauvoo, meets with the city council. They deliberate. They talk about it. They discuss, okay, what's going on here? Yes, it is lies. What are our options? They lay out all their options, and they decide as a city council and as a mayor to have the Nauvoo Expositor, the press, destroyed. Joseph Smith, as mayor, ordered the city marshal, John Green, destroy the press, scatter the type, and burn any remaining newspapers. The order was carried out within hours. The city council acted legally to abate a public nuisance. Now I pause there in this sentence. The rest of this has kind of been the narrative, and even church historians have said this. And President Oakes, as a young law professor, did research and found that this next part isn't quite true. So the next part is, although the legal opinion at the time only allowed for destruction of the public issues of the offending paper, the demolition of the press was in violation of property rights. That assumption is based on current laws now, the way we see it. But if we put ourselves in their shoes, with the laws that they had at the time, they felt they were 100% justified in what they did. President Dallin H. Oates explained it this way. The event that focuses anti-Mormon hostilities and led directly to the martyrdom was the action of Mayor Joseph Smith and the city council in closing a newly established opposition newspaper in Nauvoo. Mormon historians, including Elder B.H. Roberts, had conceded that this action was illegal. But as a young law professor pursuing original research, I was pleased to find a legal basis for this action in the Illinois law of 1844. The amendment to the United States Constitution that extended the guarantee of freedom of the press to protect against the actions of city and state governments was not adopted until 1868, and it was not enforced as a matter of federal law until 1931. So the lens which we see this action wasn't in place until 1868, years after Joseph Smith and the city council destroyed the press for the Nauvoo, or the expositor. I love President Oak's summary. We should judge the actions of our predecessors on the basis of the laws and commandments and circumstances of their day, not ours. There are people outside of the church in the Nauvoo at this time that use the destruction of that press as a flame to light a powder keg. One of those is the editor of the Warsaw Signal. These actions prompted citizen groups in Hancock County to count for the removal of the saints from the entire state of Illinois. Thomas Sharp vehemently expressed the feelings of many enemies of the church when he editorialized in the Warsaw Signal. Quote, "War and extermination is inevitable. Citizens arise, one and all. Can you stand by and suffer such infernal devils to rob men of their property and rights without avenging them? We have no time for comment. Let every man make his own. Let it be made with powder and ball." The all capitals, the multiple exclamation marks are his. For him, he wants to incite more violence. He wants this to come down to the murder of Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith, I guess you could say he's invited to Carthage, but not really. Carthage is the county seat where he needs to go. Let's just kind of clear this all up, I think is the idea. But as he goes to Carthage to deliver himself up to the pretended requirements of law, 2 or 3 days prior to assassination, he said, quote, "I'm going like a lamb to the slaughter. I'm as calm as a summer's morning. I have conscience void towards God, void of offense towards God and towards all men. I shall die innocent, and it shall be said of me, he was murdered in cold blood." The same morning, after Hyrum had made ready to go, "Shall it be said as the slaughter? Yes, for so it was." He read the following paragraph near the close of the 12th chapter of Ether in the Book of Mormon and turned down the leaf upon it. Some of those words are, "Thou hast been faithful, wherefore thou shalt be made strong, even unto the sitting down in the place which I prepared in the mansions of my Father. Now I am Moroni, I bid farewell, until we shall meet before the judgment seat of Christ." And you can see a picture of the Book of Mormon that Hyrum Smith read from, and the page that he dog-eared, turned down. As Joseph and Hyrum head to Carthage, they've received promises, assurances from Governor Ford, he's the governor of Illinois, that they would be protected. Governor Ford does go to Carthage to try and neutralize the situation, but he also says to Joseph, "I insist you come to Carthage. If you don't, I'll call it the militia, and we will go to Nauvoo in force." Governor Ford does not think highly of Joseph Smith. He does write his memoirs, kind of the history of the state of Illinois. And here's his summary of Joseph Smith. He said, quote, "Thus fell Joe Smith, the most successful impostor in modern times, a man who, ignorant and coarse, had some great natural parts, which fitted him for temporary success, but which were so obscured and counteracted by the inherent corruption and vices of his nature, that he could never succeed in establishing a system of policy which to permanent success in the future. And President Gordon B. Hinckley added this, such is the appraisal of Joseph Smith by Thomas Ford. President Hinckley continued, I wish not to be critical of Governor Ford. I feel sorry for him. I regard him as one who sowed the wind and reaped the whirlwind. In April of 1847, when our people began to long westward march from winter quarters on the Missouri Valley to the Valley of the Great Salt Lake, Governor Ford and his family moved to Peoria, with the intent he would practice law. I now quote from Mr. Quaife. The story of his 3 years' sojourn is one of unrelieved poverty and defeat. Mrs. Ford, afflicted with cancer, died October 12, 1850, at the early age of 38. 3 weeks later, on November 3rd, he followed her to the grave. Left behind were 5 orphan children, penniless and of tender years, to face the world as best they might. In the autumn of 1872, Thomas, the youngest son, was hung as a horse thief near Caldwell, Kansas, by a lynching party. 2 years later, in 1874, Sewell, his brother, and 2 other outlaws were hung from the same branch of a tree near Wellington, Kansas, by another lynching party. They were buried in unmarked graves on the Kansas prairie. President Hinckley concludes, I mention these things to say that there was tragedy on both sides of the Carthage problem. Joseph and Hyrum were murdered. Governor Thomas Ford, who had pledged the protection of the state of Illinois and failed to provide it, fell upon tragic and sorrowful circumstances, dying in abject poverty and leaving a destitute family for whom the most part also lived with disappointment and died with much misery. As Joseph goes to Carthage, he and his brother end up in Carthage Jail. And if you go there, you'll notice that upstairs was the place where prisoners were interred. And if you see that on the little diagram, that's number 5. Where the number 1 is where the sheriff, the guy who's in charge of the jail, the jailer had a place for him and his family. This is his bedroom. He realizes that Joseph Smith is in danger. He also realizes that Joseph is not the individual that they're accusing him of. He shows him great respect by allowing him to be in his bedroom, and that's where he stays instead of work behind bars. Now on Thursday, the 27th of June, Joseph requests Dan Jones to descend and inquire of the guard the cause for the disturbance of the night before. Frank Worrell, the officer of the guard, who was one of the Carthage Greys, in a very bitter spirit, said, We've had too much trouble to bring old Joe here to let him ever escape alive. Unless you want to die with him, you better leave before sundown, and you'll see that I can prophesy better than old Joe. Cyrus Wheelock had smuggled a gun to Joseph before, and so Joseph does have this gun when they attack the jail at Carthage. Just give a couple other pictures of the actual jail cell here. Those who attack will come from that bottom floor up this set of stairs. At the top is a door that goes into the bedroom where Joseph and Hyrum and 2 others are staying. As the mob starts their attack, they come up the stairs, and Joseph and Hyrum put their shoulders to the door. A bullet goes through the door and enters the side of Hyrum's face, and he dies, falling, exclaiming that I'm a dead man. I try and picture myself being in that room and just seeing the bullets flying through the air. And what Joseph's actions are. They're not to go hide in a corner. They're not to hide under the bed. Joseph, seemingly on purpose, realizes there are 2 men alive there, and these people will stop at nothing until he's dead. He approaches the window. He's shot a couple times from outside, which force should kind of put him back, but instead he leans forward and is shot as he's going out the window. He falls to the ground and is dead. Inside, I believe that action saves the life of John Taylor and Willard Richards. Willard Richards had a prophecy where Joseph Smith had said, You will come a time where you'll see bullets flying like hail around you, but you will not be harmed. You can tell from the picture he's a bigger boy. He was not harmed. John Taylor did not have that promise. He is wounded very, very difficultly. He is shot one of those places. Bullets goes into his watch, And you can see this is his picture of his watch. The hour and the minute hand have long been lost, so we don't know where that was. After the death, they put Joseph and Hyrum's bodies into plain pine boxes, put a little cloth over them to save it, and some pine boughs to keep the sun off of it. They take it back to Nauvoo, and they make, I guess we'd call them death masks. So here's what Joseph and Hyrum looked like in life. Because of the threats of violence, they were concerned that the bodies would be dug up and abused. They did not bury the bodies where they currently are. There was a little bit of a ruse with the funeral, and it wasn't until 1928 that the bodies were moved to their permanent location in Nauvoo, right along the bend of the Mississippi River. Section 135 really talks about the focus. What did Joseph do? Here's some of the events that led up to it. Joseph knew he was going like a lamb to the slaughter. But also it's a celebration of some of the things that the prophet Joseph Smith did. Verse 3, Joseph Smith, the prophet and seer Lord, has done more, save Jesus only, for the salvation of men in this world than any other man who ever lived in it. And I think that's a pretty bold statement. But you think the ramifications of temple ordinances, how that affects generations before us, and generations to come. That's a pretty accurate statement. And then there's a list of things of what Joseph Smith did, and maybe as you read it, you might just be thinking, which accomplishment of Joseph Smith means the most to me, and why? So verse 3 continues, in the space of 20 years, he has brought forth the Book of Mormon, which he translated by the gift and power of God, and has been means of publishing it on 2 continents, has sent the fullness of the everlasting gospel which it contained to the 4 corners of the earth, has brought forth the revelations and commandments which compose of this book of doctrine and covenants, and many other wise documents and instructions for the benefit of the children of men, gathered many thousands of Latter-day Saints, founded a great city, left a fame and name that cannot be slain. He lived great, he died great in the eyes of God and his people, and like most of the Lord's anointed in ancient times, has sealed his mission and his works with his own blood. And so has his brother Hyrum. In life they were not divided, and in death they were not separated. I'm not going to try and pretend like I know Joseph Smith more than anyone else. But I would think that if he was here, he would probably remind us that his purpose as a prophet was to bring us to Jesus Christ. So for me, as a summary for Joseph's life, I would simply ask people, how did Joseph Smith help bring you closer to Jesus Christ? Because that was Joseph's focus, his mission as a prophet, to bring us closer to Christ. After Joseph's death, the first presidency is dissolved, and the Quorum of 12 are all over the place. For example, in Boston, you have 4 of the apostles, Brigham Young, Orson Hyde, Orson Pratt, and Wilford Woodruff. In Philadelphia, you have Heber C. Kimball and Lyman Wright. New York, you have Parley P. Pratt and William Smith. In Pittsburgh, you have John E. Page. In Michigan, you have George Albert Smith. And then you have the 2 that are in Nauvoo. And you may be asking, what are 10 of the 12 doing outside of Nauvoo? Why are they in the eastern states of the United States of America? They are called on missions to the eastern states to promote, in large part, the presidency of Joseph Smith. Now, these were missions. They were preaching the gospel too, but they were also talking about the platform that Joseph Smith had established for becoming president. And if you want a really short little article, I'll put the link in my notes. In Wikipedia, the Joseph Smith 1844 presidential campaign, I think they do a pretty good summary of it. Well, the Quorum of 12, as they learn about the prophet Joseph Smith's death, start to return to Nauvoo. Sidney Rigdon, who's been a member of the First Presidency, arrives on the 3rd of August. When they all arrive, they realize that it's a very difficult time for the saints. Wilford Woodruff captures it pretty well when he says, "When we landed in the city, there was a deep gloom and seemed to rest over the city of Nauvoo, which we had never experienced before. We were received with gladness by the saints throughout the city. They felt like sheep without a shepherd, as being without a father, as their head had been taken away." Sidney Rigdon, the first counselor in the First Presidency, had arrived in Nauvoo from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In the year before that time, he began to take course contrary to the counsel that the prophet Joseph Smith had given him, and become estranged or separated from the church. He refused to meet with the 3 members of the Quorum of the 12 that were already in Nauvoo, and instead spoke to a large group of saints assembled for their Sunday worship services. Sidney called for a special meeting to be held on Tuesday, August 6th, so that church members could choose a guardian for the church. It appears that though he chose August 6th as a meeting, so that would be a date that was held prior to when the majority of the Quorum of the 12 would return from missions to the eastern United States. Brother Rigdon claimed that because he had previously been called and ordained as a spokesman for Joseph Smith, that it was his responsibility to see that the church was governed in a proper manner. He claimed he should be the guardian of the people, and in fulfilling that responsibility, he was doing what God wanted him to do. He wasn't the only one that believed that he should be the next leader of the church. Others stepped forward and made claims. So, just one other example, James Strang. He had been baptized in February 1844. He was exploring a possible location for the saints in Wisconsin in the spring of 1844. After the martyrdom, Brother Strang claimed to have received revelation in a letter from Joseph, stating he had been appointed to be Joseph's successor. Brother Strang's letter, which he showed to members of the church, appeared to have Joseph Smith's signature. Brother Strang claimed to be the next prophet and announced his position at a conference of the church in Michigan in August 5th, 1844. What many of these claims seem to forget is what Joseph had taught. He had taught that when Joseph was gone, there was no more first presidency. In section 107, when there's no more first presidency, there's a quorum that's equal in authority. That's the Quorum of the 12. Joseph taught, where I am, there is no presidency over the 12. When it came down to it, the church leaders or church members were saying it's got to be one of 2 people. One, it's the president of the Quorum of the 12, Brigham Young, and the Quorum of the 12 should be leading us. But there's also some thoughts with Sidney Rigdon. He'd been a member of the first presidency. He had been instrumental, and he's a powerful speaker. And so there's a meeting August 8th, and it's held east of the Nauvoo Temple, and Sidney Rigdon's the first one to get up and speak. He speaks for an hour and a half. He has the wind that's coming into his face. And as a result, when you get the wind into your face, people can't hear you as well. And so there's quite a bit of the members who hear bits and pieces, but they struggle to hear Sidney. Hour and a half later, when Brigham Young stands up, the wind stops, and there's calm. It's not only just that physical calm, but there now becomes a spiritual experience that many, many saints experience. Benjamin F. Johnson recalls President Brigham Young rose and spoke. I saw him arise, but as soon as he spoke, I jumped on my feet. For in every possible degree, it was Joseph's voice and his person. In look, attitude, dress, and appearance was Joseph himself personified. And I knew in a moment the spirit and mantle of Joseph was upon him. William C. Staines described Brigham Young as speaking with the voice like the voice of Joseph, Prophet Joseph. I thought it was he. So did thousands who heard it. Wilford Woodruff wrote, if I had not seen him with my own eyes, there is no one who could have convinced me that it was not Joseph Smith. And anyone can testify to this who is acquainted with these 2 men. George Q. Cannon, who was 17 years old in 1844, remembered if Joseph had arisen from the dead and had spoken in their hearing, the effect could not have been more startling than it was to many present at that meeting. It was the voice of Joseph himself. And not only was it the voice of Joseph, which was heard, but it seemed in the eyes of the people as if the very person of Joseph which stood before them. The Lord gave his people a testimony that left no room for doubt as to who the man had chosen to lead them. A few weeks ago, I was teaching an adult religion class. And it wasn't on this topic, but someone who was there asked if any of us had prayed, and that we too knew that Brigham Young was a prophet. Because a lot of times you think about for us, we've prayed if the Book of Mormon is true. We know it is. We've prayed, is Joseph Smith a prophet? Or was he a prophet? Yes. I think most of us have that feeling about our current prophet. We've had that experience when we were in a meeting where the new prophet was announced and bore his testimony and taught, and we felt the Spirit, and we know, okay, this individual, Russell M. Nelson, is a prophet of God. For the saints at this time, they felt that. And as this gentleman in the class asked the question, I thought, I know that too. And I told the class, I know that. Brigham Young was a prophet as well. I love the way Brigham Young kind of summarized his feelings after Sidney spoke. Brigham Young said this: "I care not who leads the church, but one thing I must know, and that is what God says about it. I have the keys and the means of obtaining the mind of God on the subject. Joseph conferred upon our heads," referring to the Quorum of 12, "all the keys and powers belonging to the apostleship, which he himself held before he was taken away. How often has Joseph said to the 12, I have laid the foundation, and you must build thereon, for upon your shoulders the kingdom rests." This experience, for many members of the church, was a very spiritual experience where they knew that Brigham Young was a next leader of the church, the president of the Quorum of the 12. So you think, okay, after this experience, what do the saints do? What's their focus? Well, the Lord had told Joseph Smith in Revelation on September 6, 1842, that there needs to be a focus, and keep doing it. Let the work of my temple not cease. And that becomes their focus. They're working to get the temple built and the ordinances done in it. But opponents of the saints in Warsaw and Carthage began to agitate more for the expulsion from Illinois of the saints after the death of Joseph Smith. In October 1844, a great gathering was announced in Warsaw. Although it was purported to be a wolf hunt, it was known that the wolves were hunted were the Mormons. Governor Ford later recalled, "The malcontents abandoned their design, and all the leaders of it fled to Missouri. The Carthage Greys fled almost in a body, carrying their arms along with them. During our stay in the county, the anti-Mormons thronged into the camp and conversed freely with the men, who were so fast infected with their prejudices that it was impossible to get any of the officers to aid in expelling them." To kind of put it in perspective, Nauvoo is not a small town back then. It is second in population to the city of Chicago in Illinois, in that state. Chicago's population was 15,000 at the time. Nauvoo's population was in 1845 was 12,000 individuals, and was growing more rapidly than Chicago. So in 1845, the end of 1845 and 46, the saints are working hard on the temple. They're performing ordinances in the temple, but they're also making preparations to leave Nauvoo. In early 1846, the majority of the saints leave the city. They leave the city, some of the times with their door wide open, knowing they'll never get a dime for their land, their farm, their fields. Some of them know that as they leave the temple, they'll never return, and all their sacrifice for them was for them to get their ordinances done. The temple is dedicated on the 30th of April, 1846. The saints leave it behind and start their trek from Nauvoo. The intent in 1846 is to get all the way to the Salt Lake Valley, and it soon becomes very apparent that's not going to happen. They have to cross Iowa. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Iowa, but you go to Nebraska and it's a little bit more flat. Iowa doesn't have like these big mountains, but the path that they're taking is going to take them, it's like big hills and into like a gully. And the bottom of that swell, when it rains, gets very, very wet. It becomes a marsh. And you don't have a highway, you don't have a freeway there. It is an unpaved road in many parts. There's bogs that they're going through. And as they go through in the rain, they just get bogged down. The church, under Brigham Young's direction, gets a lot of waypoints. And that includes Sugar Creek, Locust Creek, Garden Grove, and Mount Pisgah. On their way to Council Bluffs. Now, Council Bluffs is where Brigham Young will set up the church governing place. On the other side is going to be winter quarters of the river. And this is kind of their staging area. And while Brigham Young is here, he has questions about what are we doing as far as moving? What advice would you give us in our trek west? So the Lord gives revelation, now known as section 136, to the camp of Zion. Some of the challenges they've had as they leave in February and March. They leave and it's very difficult situations. They don't have a lot of money. They had some time, but they're not as prepared as what they could be. When the saints crossed the Mississippi River into Iowa, they began a new quest for a home where they could build the kingdom of God without oppression. The way to this new refuge was not easy. It exacted toil, sacrifice, and death. The first leg of the journey, the trek across Iowa territory, proved to be the hardest. The main camp of Israel took 131 days to cover 300 miles as they traveled across Iowa. Now put that in perspective. 131 days to do 300 miles. It takes less time by 20 days for the saints to cover 3 times as many miles going from winter quarters to Salt Lake Valley. So the Pioneer Company a year later took only 111 days to cover 1,050 miles from winter quarters to the Great Salt Lake Valley. Inadequate preparation, lack of knowledgeable guides, delays, miserable weather, and difficult terrain made the Iowa journey one of the most trying in the church's history. Nevertheless, these hardy folk never knew such word as the word fail. And maybe to put yourself in Brigham Young's shoes, maybe think of a time when you had to organize a very large group. It could have been a youth conference. It could have been a young women's camp. Maybe it was your pioneer trek for your ward, your branch, your stake. Think about the challenges you faced. And Brigham Young faces those same kind of challenges. How would you organize all these people? And how would you cross? And what was the number one thing you'd emphasize to help them in their way across? I love the Lord's advice. He starts right up front. The number one thing you focus on is your covenant. 136 verse 2, let the people of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and those journeying with them be organized into companies with a covenant and a promise to keep all the commandments and statutes of the Lord our God. Let the companies be organized with captains of hundreds and fifties and tens, captains of tens, with the president and his 2 counselors at their head, under the direction of the 12 apostles. And this shall be our covenant, that we will walk in all the ordinances of the Lord. I love that emphasis. I think for me, I see that as a theme for Brigham Young as he's going west and remains in the Salt Lake Valley. Things focus on the covenant you've made with God. And don't let that covenant, the fire of that covenant, dim or diminish, but let it be flamed. Brigham Young, a little bit later, as they're on their journey in the big company, there's some dissension, there's some complaining, there's some murmuring. He stops and he says this: now is the time for labor. Let the fire of the covenant, which you've made in the house of the Lord, burn in your hearts like a flame unquenchable. And in that context, I look at section 136. There are principles that would help us to keep the covenants that we've made alive and burning in our hearts. These principles of preparation for our day really is part of focusing on the covenant, focusing on the promises we've made to consecrate our time and our talents to help bless other people and the Lord and His church, the wise use of our agency, and that we're accountable for the things that the Lord has given us. There is a promise that God's given us that help prepares us for our future promised land. And God reminds us that there's a stewardship. God's given us certain gifts and talents and abilities that will help us prepare in our day. There's also counsel for our day in that section. I'm only going to go for a few, but there's a lot that could be very applicable to us today. Some of the things that I just note: go thy way and do as I've told you, and fear not. And then maybe two sides of one coin I mention. Cease to speak evil one of another. On the other side, let your words tend to edifying or build up one another. And if you're sorrowful, call on the Lord thy God with supplication, that their souls may be joyful. And then the Lord wants the saints to understand something from His perspective. Some of the people are asking, why did Joseph have to die? And the Lord answers it. Many have marveled because of Joseph Smith's death. But it was needful that he should seal his testimony with his blood, that he might be honored and the wicked might be condemned. Well, just give a couple teaching thoughts. If you're teaching this in a home or in a classroom, just as you mentioned what Joseph Smith did, think about what he taught, what he did that helped brought you closer to Jesus Christ. Maybe you have an opportunity to share that. And how can we enable the fire of the covenant to burn in our hearts like a flame unquenchable? And maybe with section 136, how can the principles taught in section 136 help us in our pioneer trek to the promised land? Now, I also add one addendum. I often think if Joseph Smith could come and preach one more sermon, wonder what he'd say. If I could ask Joseph Smith one question, what would I ask him? Well, in February 1846, the prophet Joseph appeared to Brigham Young in a dream. Brigham explained to Joseph how much he missed his companionship. And then he asked Joseph, "Do you have a message for the saints?" I have found Joseph's last message. Now this is the second appearance of Joseph to Brigham Young in a dream. The second message that Joseph shared with Brigham, a message to the saints, is as applicable today as it ever was in Joseph's time, and maybe even more so. In the dream, Brigham recorded, "Joseph stepped toward us and looked very earnestly yet pleasantly said, 'Tell the people to be humble and faithful, and be sure to keep the Spirit of the Lord, and it will lead them right. Be careful and not turn away from the still small voice. It will teach them what to do and where to go. It will yield the fruits of the kingdom. Tell the brethren that if they'll follow the Spirit of the Lord, they will go right.'" Maybe that's one of the great blessings of our day, is that we can feel and know what the Spirit of the Lord is telling us, and to follow that guidance. Thanks for spending a few moments with me as we covered section 135 and 136. I hope you have a lovely day. Keep smiling. Bye.